Hello, thank you for joining us once again. We're here to have some good discussions on politics and the structure of our governance and elections. You know that the NDC, the main opposition party, has made some proposals, 30 in number and in excess, generally not only to the commission, and then also for all of us to think about, but we want to speak to the Executive Director for the Institute for Democratic Governance, Dr. Emmanuel Akwetey, and ask him his thoughts on those proposals by the NDC, but also how far-reaching they could be if they accepted in strengthening our electoral, political, and governance system. And you get all these updates. We're talking about TV3 Ghana on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and also 3FM 92.7. Go search for them. But I have to say that, Dr. Akwetey, thank you for joining us. But all the electoral reforms that we've undertaken since 1992, how far-reaching have they been in strengthening our governance system, or the electoral fortunes, as we'll call it?
Oh, it did tremendously positive. You know, first of all, after the December 1992 parliamentary elections, which was boycotted by the MPP also decided to create some kind of ungovernability as part of their protest. And then it took the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Sir Geoffrey Howe, to come down and engage. And fortunately, MPP had the late statesman, Mr. Darocha, who then came out after I think they've done their internal thing, said, we can do business, you see. And so it shifted us from what could have been some really nasty, violent scene. You know, they could go guerrilla, you know, and these days there are so many weapons that you can never tell. But they opted then to get into dialogue to address the issues and resolve them. Okay, and then fortunately they had Afarijan, Dr. Afarijan, you know, distinguished in a way in his own scholarship and his own wisdom and ability to deal with people and so on, opened this channel up for the dialogue. So IPAC was for the dialogue, but it was an administrative thing under the Electoral Commission. It was very new, you know. And so if you look at it, it was an option to what they would have considered an exclusion and a violation of their rights, and they could have fought for it, which would not have been get well for the country. So it's commendable that both of them and the little parties around them agree that, look, we would rather talk. And then when it came to that, you ask yourself, where are you going to talk? Okay, where's the mechanism for this kind of sustained dialogue? And once IPAC was created, opened, innovative in a way, with the EC as convener, they started talking about the issues. So you saw a new register come up, you saw transparent ballot boxes in, you saw how actually our electoral system, especially on election day, the transparency where voters vote and they stand and they watch everything till midnight or whatever, it's not common in other countries. I didn't see it in South Africa, I didn't see it in Kenya. I asked, where are they? It's only the Electoral Commission officials. And few of the parties had their reps there. You know, but the confidence in the Electoral Commission officials is almost absolute, total. Of course, I must say that in Kenya, the interesting thing is that it is in the transmission, the transmission of the results, that process, that brings about changes in the figures, but not what you got at the polling station. You know, so that's a strange system. I think they've improved it now. But going forward, I think the parties, and that's what is democracy. You might question whether that took as far. It did, because you see, democracy is consolidated when the leaders decide to talk about whatever the problem, than fight. And once they decided to talk, and there was a mechanism for that, it sustained reforms, incremental reforms, from 94, 95, up to we got the biometric voters register. So, and the reform was phenomenal and pioneering because other countries adopted it. The transparent ballot box, for instance, you know, We were not the first to do biometric registration and a register. Nigeria did first, but Nigeria was more or less partial. And then Ghana went the whole hog and so on, and others then emulated and came. And then you had the operation of IPAC and the ability to do the reforms, build the consensus, get the parties to go back into their own membership and persuade them to accept it, get the endorsement of the government, and so on, became something that many countries learned from. I mean, the Nigerians would not play with Dr. Farijan, Mr. Kanga, Mr. Kantanka. You know, they trained in Africa everywhere. So that mechanism of IPAC and the training that went with it and the willingness of the parties to come and negotiate, discuss, build consensus, that steered our stability. That gave us the consolidation. And all in all, it worked to a point. You know, initially there was no biometric register concept. But at some point, as things became more and more challenging, the results were getting closer and closer, the mistrust and suspected mischief, you know, and both parties were competing in a way. I think it was an important contribution to our stability.
If you look at the NDC's reforms, especially beginning from the first to about the fourth one, you get the inclination that there seemed to be some distrust with the Electoral Commission. How is that going to help in the acceptance of these proposed reforms, and should we be worried about them?
Yes, but the mistrust exists everywhere. It's between the parties and it affects the Commission. But politics is power. Okay, and I've always said that this system would have worked very fine if we had had only one party dominating. So powerful, it wins every election. You see that the smaller parties, okay, in relation, relative to those bigger ones, really don't get involved in so many of the things. You know, whether it's violence, they don't even indulge in the insults and so on and so forth. They lose elections, they lick their wounds. For some time, you don't hear of them, and so on. And in that silence itself, there's a certain civility that the small parties demonstrate. That its elections are over, we didn't win, let's see how we come back. And so, because apart from elections, they have nowhere else to go. In other countries, they might also be in local government. They will be elected and they'll be doing stuff, development. Parties don't do just elections. Parties also do development. And it's some kind of abnormality that in Ghana, if you're a party, you do elections, except when you're elected to govern, that you do development. And that brings a problem. So when you look at it that way, I honestly think that it is the quick rise of the opposition, particularly the MPP. Before 92, MPP had been opposition, well, some say 30 years. I haven't calculated it to get it exact. But it took them 2 terms of elections to come to power. I'm not sure that was the calculation of NDC. I think if you get into the details of the design of the system, NDC expected to be in power for a long time, especially because local government was completely controlled by the party in government. Okay, and we need to really research, why did they take 2 terms? Is it because people got fed up with, they saw NDC as the same PNDC, they didn't shift in mind, and therefore felt, well, it's long enough. But the Ghanaian electorate also evolved, okay, in that sense, and thought that term limit was important. I remember the voter register issue and the need for a new register that they agreed on. But I also remember there was this debate whether the President Rollins, for instance, would accept the term limit, you see, or he's going to do some things to go for, as it happens in other African countries. And, you know, I was observing the situation. At those days, I was in the University of Stockholm. I measure up and sit in. And I went to bars. Usually my research, I like sitting in trotro and bars, because I found that, and taxis, I found that taxi drivers were the best analysts. And then in the bar, or whether it's a chop bar or place you go to drink, like, you know, some of the places then popular in town, people talk politics, and you get a sense of what. And there was this debate as to, well, he wouldn't go. I'm sure Chronicle was really pioneering that kind of possibility. And there were others. But what I picked from ordinary people was that they should vote for him, because the Constitution says 2 terms, and after 2 terms, he won't come. They were more consumed by, so if they voted for him 1 term, would he come back? You know, and in many cases, the point I got was that, let's give him the 2 terms, and he would go. And so, as soon as he got the 2 terms after the 96 elections, the mood changed. It was like, he has to go. He served his term. He's had the 10 years, he's had the 8 years, and people were just, you know, sometimes they attribute his losing the elections to the Reform Party breakup, the presidential candidate. I still think that the mood of the electorate was that 18 years we've had him, he should go, because they didn't see the fine division between the chairman of the PNDC and the president of the Fourth Republic, sorry, excuse me. They saw the man, and they liked him anyway, but they felt that term limit was important. And so that explains it. Now, when MPP then was elected and had the trappings of power and so on, the party grew, you know, as an organization, and they have hustled, you know, been heckled and so on. But they also got that power, and that made them grow very quickly. So if you look at it, by 2008, that's when they tried the first time at Break 8, you know, and then you saw the kind of elections we had. So at that particular time, it's important that analysts look at the impact on our democracy, the impact on the party system. We were set up as a multi-party democracy, constitutional multi-party democracy. So we also expected multi-partyism to grow. And once 2 dominant parties emerged, the question was, could the framework, you know, could it hold them? And there, the first thing we saw from where we start was that, where is the state entity that would also deal with the democracy issue concerned, the multi-party democracy? The system set up was purely for elections. So a lot of power was invested in the EC. Okay, and in that case, the EC was responsible for everything. But the behavior of parties and others, much as you saw it in election, was bigger than election. They continue to exist. And therefore, you saw the tensions that were coming, and that drew attention to the design of the system, the exclusion. No matter how much power you got, you were excluded from the executive arm of government. In all democracies, it's a very unusual design, okay? And for parties that were equal, more or less, they split parliament, they alternated power and so on. You had a situation where they couldn't sit in opposition like the smaller parties. Do you see? They had strong bases. They had regions, strongholds. You know, we coined that term, strongholds, for them. And so it changed the tenor of government. The pressure came from the opposition to push things one way or the other, because it was a formidable group. If NPP hadn't grown into that kind of powerful political group that could challenge the NDC in power, but it was like CPP, PNC, and all the smaller and the new ones which do not survive, the system would not have, you know, the kind of, I don't know, I can't get the word, what shakes it up, you know, that we are seeing. And eventually, it's proving that they were not just 2 dominant parties, of course, with long historical traditions, so they were anchored, but they become the term we use as duopolies. And there was no force in the state, there was no institution. The party suddenly felt like they were the state, you see, and they could do anything. And there was nobody like the EC that looked at their behavior and how it was undermining our democracy and how we needed to tackle that. So if you look at things from that angle, close to 30 years on, for one of the parties to come up with reforms, which even talks about regulation, you know, monetization, I think it's a significant development that they have come to that realization that much more needs to be done to keep the system stable.
The proposals on the disputes, how they are resolved, the prosecution, etc., also shows that we have an electoral system that seems to always bring out some of these negativities. Also, mind whether we did a good job at the end of each electoral cycle. Should we really be worried about this?
We must really accept that the initiative of NDC is commendable, because in the past they had endorsed these things. They've kept quiet. Electoral violence did not start today. If you want to see how parliamentary by-elections became violent, Etiwa, 2010 was brutal. You saw Talensi, you saw Akwetey. You see, and what did they do? They were in power, you know, and so on. But historically too, political violence has been part of our politics in the 50s, in the 60s, you know, and so on and so forth. So if you now see, the MPP also had its share. I also West Wogon and whatever we've had. But one of them, of these duopolies, now says, hey, can we introduce some rule of law elements? Because if they had done that earlier, I mean, the violence would have stopped somehow. And it was because of this electoral violence, principally between these two parties, and the scare of it, that it could destabilize the system, that originated, okay, the idea of peace pacts, election peace pacts. The theme has always been it's electoral violence, impunity and injustice, eradicating electoral violence, impunity and injustice. And when His Majesty Otumfuo, the Peace Council chair, then Reverend Professor Asante, of course IDEG worked with them and so on, the idea was to get leaders to commit to deal with the violence and justice, because there was a tit for tat. Because what happened after Tiwa? What happened? Nothing happened. Talents. And so when you now see that MPP, you know, also came out, especially around after the court case in 2015, 2016, 2017, and you saw West Side. For them, where were you when it was happening to us? So it's like tit for tat, retaliation, and so on and so forth. But the danger of it is that it has created a situation that potentially threatens the stability of the system. I mean, what have armed vigilantes got to do with politics, with parties in our democracy? And who is arming who? And not even the parties are controlling them. I mean, it's some individuals with some kind of money in the system who mobilize and finance these groups. And what is the consequence? It's weakening the police, because when you are in government, you have control over the police, and you are also cultivating vigilantes. It has weakened the police. You know, that is more politically controlled because of the way the appointments are done, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, we were getting into a situation where probably there will be an explosion, in spite of the vigilante law, which was passed in October 2019. We had the worst violence, and then when we didn't have a vigilante law, anti-vigilante law, you know. So the trends are clear. The fight between two duopolies is against our democratic interest. That's not consolidate peace and stuff. It might get to a point that their demand to win elections by all means, so they are not marginalized, you know, would mean that they would associate with other forces. And this all happens because there's no entity in the state, anybody else that could tackle them, apart from police going to court, investigating, going to court. And if they are to go to court, then those cases have to go through the AG, the Attorney General. And the Attorney General is a politician. So both sides, you know, have played this game. But for one to wake up to the perils, to the risks, the threats, and say we are going to lose something very precious. So let's now come back to the law and define the state's role in all this, where the EC as an election management body cannot extend its remit by heart. It's a good thing. And I think MPP, I believe, would come around it because it is what is a good thing to do.
There's a bigger question, and it's very much inherent in the reforms of the NDC, about the Inter-Party Advisory Committee, as was set up by the Electoral Commission years ago. Why should we have IPAC mainstream into law backed by law?
Frankly, it's a good question you've asked. Well, I'm not a supporter of this, but I hear that the Constitutional Review Commission recommended that. And the Constitutional Review Implementation Committee also had it drafted as law, an article to change or whatever. But I disagree. I disagree in the sense that IPAC, if you saw its evolution, as we've recounted, was a mechanism under the control of the EC. It was a EC manufactured thing that enabled it to have the space not only to enforce the law, legislation, the rules, and so on, but to have some conversations. Dr. Farijan used to say that in 1992, if you sat where he was, the parties were so weak that if he had enforced the law, the political parties law and whatever, we wouldn't have had any democracy. Because that is part of the thing that PNDC did. They were not great enthusiasts of multi-party democracy, liberal democracy. And I'll tell you at some point, that informed the design of the executive arm of government. Do you see? But now, NDC has converted, to liberal democracy in many ways. You see, so there's a significant evolution that I think they should be converted for. So if you go back to IPAC, the Electoral Commission does not see dealing with just two parties as its remit, as the end of the power it has to take care of parties and elections. It invites the smaller parties because from the EC's point of view, and I think it's legitimate, political parties. It's not only two parties, it's not specified that deal with only two parties. Political parties, once they are registered, they have a certain legitimacy around it. They didn't do well in elections and so on. But the law didn't say that if you lose elections, you should be proscribed. Do you see? So when it wants to discuss things that is affecting all parties, this is the forum it has. It's the convener. And it invites other parties to come in. It worked well when we didn't have these two parties we call duopolies. Once the parties got the strength, because they've been in government 8 years, they had money, they were organizing, they were all over the country, and so on and so forth. It also reflected in IPAC. EC did not have an easy way with them. They challenged EC almost on everything. So the consensus building became difficult, and then you had a situation where it's like, who is in government? If you saw how Cabinet Japan was defending Afarijan in 2008, when NDC in opposition was raising a lot of issues, against Afarijan, and you look at Cabinet Japan or MPP in 2012 against the same Afarijan. So in a way, Afarijan, Dr. Afarijan complained. It became difficult for him to get consensus in IPAC. But he had a way of working. Sometimes he engaged civil society, and he did a lot of diplomacy to get people to talk to the two parties and all that. He did that. He came here several times. He called us. His friends at the Department of Political Science at Legon, somewhere here then, and he would invite and say, how do I handle this and so on. So that helped him find ways of, so the most important ways of managing the station. The most important thing, maybe the last important act the EC, the IPAC could perform was the agreement on electoral biometric register. But it was also enabled by President Mills, who in his desperate effort and commitment to peace, he said he would do anything that will bring peace to the country. And if it's electoral, this biometric thing that should be there, so be it. So political leadership played a certain role in getting it. But since then, IPAC has been difficult. So you will find out that most of the things that happened in 2015, 2016 before the election, it was the Supreme Court that ordered. People went with the petition whether the register has been cleaned or not, whether small parties are going to be proscribed or not. It was the Supreme Court or the High Court, you know, how they ruled that moved us in a certain direction. So the question is, IPAC for a long time has ceased to be what it was, a consensus building, recognizing that the authority was the EC. It no longer. It was challenging the EC almost on everything, the two parties. And if you are in government, you are in love with the EC. In opposition, you are not. Both parties have done that. So if you ask me going forward, if in this context, we haven't reviewed critically the purpose of the EC and how that purpose has been fulfilled over time. You know, lawyers do incremental things, precedents and so on. But social scientists, we like to review to understand what has gone wrong or what has gone correct, what are the challenges, how do you address them? It's not always the law, it's the idea that comes first, and then you see how it's legalized. In this case, if you really look at what is going on, two parties, when they're in government, they are darlings of the EC. Now, MPP doesn't find anything wrong with what EC, and we didn't even support reforms. Can you imagine? Just look at them in 2008, and then it will tell you a story. NDC as well. So if you legalize this entity as it is, what has EC then got to do its administrative consultations, to do its kind of politics, but not in the bipartisan negative. It wants people to come and talk. Politics is not always the party thing. Where is it going? What must go to IPAC and what shouldn't go to IPAC? And EC is independent. It must have the mechanism that it has created itself to facilitate that conversation. And you want to now take it away from them, from EC, and put it somewhere and say it's the law. So politics is not always the law. Politics is also dialogue. It's conversation, it's deliberation, and so on. So at the moment, I think the EC itself has to review IPAC and see how it could reform it to serve its purpose. But I like the general idea that there has to be a body where it must be a state institution that could be separate from EC, where the parties are convened. Immediately the issues are coming up and it's hot, the parties could convene. That entity of the state, we proposed in 2014 that we should set up a multi-party democracy commission, because the argument is that our democracy is just not electoral, and it is also developing because our parties have suffered since 1963, even if you look at it from 57. When 1963 64, we became the one-party state. But look, how long do they stay in power? The army comes, they are proscribed, and so on and so forth. They've gone through very rough times. And sometimes I joke that it is the spirit of the repression that is still haunting our parties. They need to be exercised. You see, and if you're going to do that, the issues they deal with are also democracy institutions and not just elections.
But that'll be it for now. We hope that you did get some education from this and got also enlightened. But we'll have more of this for you. It is a bye-bye for now.